rogaría que tomáramos asiento, por favor. Vamos a comenzar el acto. Bueno, muy buenas tardes para todos. Vamos a comenzar este acto que está siendo realizado gracias a Human Rights Alliance for Children and Families, la Alianza para los Derechos Humanos de los Niños y Familias Refugiados. Creemos que este es un grupo que tiene como propósito el buscar la defensa de esta gran cantidad de niños centroamericanos que están pasando este proceso de tragedia y de dolor para sus familias y para ellos mismos. Alguien me dijo que los niños no están rompiendo ninguna frontera, están caminando en el continente de sus ancestros y están caminando en su propia tierra. Pero este día son víctimas de leyes políticas que están afectando su vida. En este momento vamos a comenzar diciendo de que tenemos como 6 puntos importantes para la administración de Obama, que es que no esté posibilitando la deportación rápida para nuestros países, que a los niños se les dé la protección tal como el 2008, que es darle protección y refugio a estos jovencitos como parte de los derechos humanos que tiene la Carta de Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de la niñez. Pero creo que avanzar sobre este tema, tenemos hoy personalidades que han hecho estudio, que están trabajando de cerca con esta problemática y que creo que nos van a dar luces acerca de qué es lo que está pasando en la situación. Van a haber preguntas, estas preguntas tienen que ver con el moderador, que muy pronto se los voy a presentar, y después creo que va a haber una discusión, un foro con ustedes que tengan alguna duda. Así que quiero darles las gracias, agradecerles a todos por su presencia y llamaría en este momento al moderador de este evento, el director ejecutivo de Comis Unidos, el señor Alex Sánchez. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. ¿Hay alguien acá que no habla español? Ok, pues me va a la esquina ya, por favor. Si hay alguien que no habla español, podemos tener a uno de nuestros voluntarios acá para que traduzca en español, para pues todos, porque tenemos a alguien, unos que no hablan inglés, a mí en español. So, si necesitan traducción, ¿verdad? Allá hay unos voluntarios que pueden ayudar. Bueno, de todo modo, muchas gracias a todos por venir este día. Este es un día de que pues se ha tenido que venir por la emergencia. This is a day that has had to be done because the emergency of this crisis that it has created on a national and international level. There's an outcry by everybody in other nations in regards to what's happening with our Central American youth that are fleeing not only violence, but economic violence, that are fleeing the economy, the poverty, but also police repression. And this has been an ongoing thing that is not new. It has not been something that's been new for our community. It's been something that has been ongoing. And the panel that we have today, our experts on this issue have been at the forefront on this issue, not a month ago when it all came out to the public, but they have been doing it for years in our communities. We have to understand that it's not something new, that it wasn't about just coyotes telling people to come and get refuge behind DACA. We know that that's not true. And we know also that this is not an issue that's exclusively about immigration reform. This is an issue of refugees, of children that are fleeing because they're being trafficked, because they're being abused, because they're being abandoned. And this is why we organized here today to with the Alianza. We organized with different groups and created the Alliance for Human Rights for Child Refugees and Families, which became important because it was composed of organizations and activists that have been doing this type of work around immigration and criminal justice issues that had come together and denounced it. So we encourage people to sign on and continue supporting this effort locally, but also nationally. Every day there's something new about this issue. We are faced today with the people, extreme anti-immigrant folks that are pushing to take away the 2008 law that came into effect for child refugees. And we cannot let that happen. We cannot let that happen. This is about children. It's about children that are fleeing, that are seeking a different place to live in because their governments are not capable and have not been able to change how they've dealt with our people in our countries. And the U.S. has had some blame in this. Foreign policy is an issue, so we need to push on those issues so they can have this government down there also change their policies about their own citizens in those countries so we can eradicate the issue of why people have to flee and leave their children behind. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists today that have come from different parts of the United States. Some of them are dear friends, some of them I met not too long ago. Some of them have been doing this work on a national level, international level, and so over here, starting with Luis Cardona from the Montgomery County. He's been working as a peacemaker dealing with issues of youth violence in the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services. He's an adjunct professor at the Institute of Public and Safety and Justice at the University of the District of Columbia. Next to him, we have Elizabeth Camarena, who's from Casa Cornelia, an organization that's been at the Fort Manoso in San Diego. It's a nonprofit law firm which provides quality pro bono legal services to approximately 1,000 victims of human civil rights violations each year. She is the supervisor of its legal program, including an asylum program, domestic violence victims of serious crime program, and children's program. They provide pro bono services to the youth at the border. Also, Federico Bustamante, who is the director of Casa Libre, which is an emergency and long-term shelter for homeless boys under the age of 18 that's located here in Los Angeles. Mr. Bustamante has traveled the globe extensively, in particular Latin America. He's lived in El Salvador. He understands what's happening in regards of why the children are coming to this community specifically. And one person that doesn't really need no introduction, ¿verdad? It's Marta Arevalo, the executive director of CARECEN, who has been at the forefront. CARECEN has been an organization that has been here since the 80s, and it started because of the need to shelter and provide refuge to those that were fleeing the civil war and the violence in Central America during the 80s, which was a war that was also funded in part by the United States. And we're leaving that again today for what it seems we have a new wave of children that are coming. So with that, we're going to go in and ask some questions, and then we want you to expand on the work that you do as well with the questions that we're doing. Let's get the wrong sheet of questions.
Alex, ¿todo está en español o todo en inglés?
Todo en inglés. Sí. Lo que necesita en traducción. ¿Cuánto dice?
You started saying that everything was in Spanish and now it's in English.
Me confundí. So, ¿cuánta gente no habla inglés? Ok, so, si se puede sentar ahí con alguien para que le traduzca, por favor, si sería. ¿Le pueden traducir, por favor, ahí? Sí. Así le pueden traducir porque pues, la mayoría solo hablamos inglés. ¿Ok? Solo hablamos. ¿Está bueno? Si me disculpan por esa falta de comunicación, allá me están regañando atrás. Ok, si podemos proceder. What was the political and historical context of this situation? First, I guess we have to understand it. Why will something like this happen at this time, right? And so, why? What are those things that have motivated this issue? And I'll throw it on the table. Who could answer or give us a better understanding of why that is in the historical context? And I guess I'll start with Marta, since CARECEN has been here from the beginning in the 80s in regards to what happened before. What is the historical context of this issue? Why is it happening now?
How far back do we start? Well, you know, I guess when I try to explain it even to my own family, well, thank you all for coming, first of all. Welcome to CARECEN, and this is your home. But when I even start to try to explain the situation to even family members or people that are not really involved in these type of issues, I start with kind of a rundown from when the United Fruit Company came to the Central American region and began to really devastate the region of its natural resources and land, and really to kind of create a feudal system in the region in Central America. And so you have, you know, a situation where very few own the majority of the land, a few own and have the majority of the wealth of those countries. Then in the decades that came after that, you have U.S. intervention in making sure that they installed military regimes that led the country, and that really were, you know, allies of the United States. And unfortunately, there was incredible amount of corruption, right, and oppression, which for many decades led to a number of revolts, and, you know, the majority poor, right, a working class, organizing, doing away with depression and repression in those countries, in particular in Salvador, which led to a war, and, you know, several wars in Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, civil wars in the 70s and 80s that lasted to the early 90s in El Salvador in particular, and Guatemala much longer than that. Then you have a broken immigration system that hasn't been addressed in a couple of decades. And in the last immigration reform during the Clinton era, IRA, which really was what kind of has given us this broken system that we have now, where the criminalization of immigrants begun, where it used to be an administrative, you know, infraction, I guess, of the law, and now after that it became a criminal offense. And of course the war on drugs, right, the so-called war on drugs that really has not solved the trafficking problem, has not solved the drug usage problem, and if anything, it has made it worse, and it has taken the situation in these countries through the drug traffic route and has created a new level of violence, a whole new level of violence. And in recent years, you have now statistics that tell us that Honduras, for example, is the most violent country in the world that doesn't have a war going on. You have murder rates in El Salvador that are about the same, if not a little higher, than during the Civil War, currently. You have murder rates in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and Honduras that are about 6 times greater than they are in Mexico, and about 9 times greater than they are in the United States. So when I hear, you know, politicians or even sometimes our own community say that this is happening because of an amazing marketing campaign by coyotes, you know, I say that's nothing new. Coyotes have been lying to people to increase their business forever. There's nothing new about that. Of course, it's a factor. Misinformation is definitely a factor among our community because there's this hope, right, for a better future, for a better life, and they're willing to believe anything somebody tells them, to keep hoping for something better. But really, you have this campaign of misinformation, right, that this is the reason, and then you have our side, which is based on facts. You know, when the United Nations is saying that Honduras is the most violent country in the world, that's based on real facts and real research. And so it's amazing to me that the rumor has more weight in the media and with politicians than the actual facts and the research that is out there that says otherwise. That the children are coming because they're living a level of violence that is incredible. The other thing I forgot to mention that I think has been a major cause has been a failed deportation policy. A few decades ago, MS-13 and 18th String Gang did not exist in Central America. You know, they exist now because members of those gangs have been deported to Central America and therefore have grown in that region and have become part of the drug trade in that region. And so, you know, it's a complex issue. It's a complex issue. But when we see our cases, you know, we represent children, unaccompanied minors in terms of their illegal cases. And when we hear stories like a 14-year-old Honduran boy who is one of our clients where his father was murdered by the gangs, his mother witnessed the murder. She then had to be hospitalized in a mental hospital because of her trauma, and he was left alone. He was left alone from, you know, family member to family member, but never really having a home or a family. His only choice was to leave and to find a better future for himself. And so he didn't even have family here to reunite with. He's completely alone. And he left because the gang told him, "We killed your dad, you're next. Either you join us or we're gonna kill you." That's real. That's what's happening. Those are the stories that we're hearing every single day. And so again, it's a complex issue. It's not just this year. We see the surge of the children started to happen in 2010, when we began to see as migration from Mexicans began to go down, migration from Central Americans, you know, started to go up, and it got younger and younger and younger every year. When you have the problems this complex that doesn't get addressed, you reach a point of no return. You reach the tipping point. You reach an explosion, and I think that that's what we are faced today. And I guess I end my comments by saying, if we don't solve these problems in the short term and in the long term, if we don't involve the region, Mexico, Central America, the United States, if we don't involve everybody that has a responsibility, then unfortunately we're not going to find those long-term answers to really stop this problem.
Thank you, Marta. Now, Elizabeth, working at the border, right? What has been the response, at least from organizations such as your organization, ¿verdad? Casa Cornelia, but also the authority at the border? How have they reacted? How have you seen them react to the situation at the border? And how are these children, you know, are they coming and turning themselves in, or are they actually attempting to go through the desert?
We've had, since about 2010, as you have stated, we have seen a rise, not only in the stereotypical child that comes unaccompanied, which was the male between 15 and 16, 17 years of age. Now we started a steady increase in seeing girls, and a steady increase in very young children, and also siblings. Either sister or brother traveling alone, or sisters traveling together. And the stories are exactly the same. It is the rise in the criminal elements in their community, and the lack of resources in trying to prevent either abuse in the home, abuse on the street. And what we did at Casa Cornelia, we actually trained and supervised a lot of volunteer attorneys from the private bar to help us representing these children. There are very few immigration practitioners in the United States. Immigration law is very complex. It is understood by few of us, and actually we need a lot of help. So what we have done in the last 2 years, we have really raised our program in training attorneys to help us represent these children. Last year we saw about 300 children who came through the detention facility in San Diego. We have 2 detention facilities in San Diego County. We represent all of the children that go through there. Last year, we represented about 300. So far this year, we've had a 70% increase in the numbers going through the facilities. This is an issue because the kids are going through there so quickly that it doesn't give us a lot of time to be able to assess why they're coming, whether they have any legal relief, and to really orient them as to what they can expect once they are in the United States. It is really important, even though as young as they are, to let them know that this is not an easy, I guess, life that they have started. This is just the beginning of their immigration case. And it is a very hard concept to explain to a 10-year-old who I have in front of me, trying to explain to him or her that they will soon be reunified with a family member or a family friend. However, their immigration case has started. It is complex. It is very difficult for them to comprehend the level of involvement they will have with the federal government in trying to deport them. And I do get that question, well, why would they deport me? Why can't they help me? Historically, Central American countries are probably the least likely to be provided asylum protection in the United States. And I think it's very well tied to the politics between the countries. So that is very reflective of what we see in the courts. It is very difficult to gain asylum for anybody from Central America, much more a child. The laws pertaining to children who are fleeing gang violence and criminal cartels is an extremely difficult burden on the child to be able to prove to an immigration judge that they deserve protection. So they do, we are in desperate need of attorneys who are able to walk them through that very difficult period in their lives. And we will really welcome anyone, not only the person with a law degree, but also the person who can speak the language well, who is able to interpret for those attorneys who cannot speak the language but are very compassionate in representing the children.
Thank you. What has been the U.S. response to this? And I guess I'll direct this to Luis Cardona in regards of the regional area in Washington, D.C. We know that there's been ongoing meetings and gatherings of ambassadors. We had the ambassador Zamora from El Salvador came out being really critical of the policies and the way that the United States was reacting to the issue. So, in your experience there, what has been the response of the U.S. Basically the Central American regional response to that?
So you're talking about the diaspora, right?
Yes.
Okay. So, in light of some of the things that our sister touched on in the beginning, right? There was an immediate outrage in light of the historical things that you talked about, in light of the kind of oops, we didn't know this was going to happen when they had the coup in Honduras in 2009. In light of this vacuum of millions and millions of dollars that's gone to Central America and their law enforcement agencies to address security, to the extent that 2 years ago the Secretary General of the World Bank said in the past 10 years there's been more investment in private security in Central America, but yet it's more unsafe than before. So when we heard President Obama, kind of reinforce what we already had been seeing and dealing with, it was really frustrating because for many of us who have been advocates, right, for the plight of so many Central American children in our work, we're going to put more money into CARECEN, which we know has been one of the major causes of all this instability, of all these safety and security issues. It's made the violence issue even worse. And even for me personally, having been more involved with, especially El Salvador a couple years ago, and seeing firsthand what the long-term impacts of the issue that you talked about, I felt compelled to talk to my colleagues. I spoke to Abel Núñez, who's with CARECEN in D.C., delegate Anasol Gutierrez, who was a delegate in Montgomery County, Council Member Nancy Navarro, who was at Montgomery County, and many of our other colleagues, both in the government and in the community sector. And we immediately recognized that something needed to be done locally, which led to the conversation I had with you and other folks here in California to see how we move forward on this. And immediately for us, the immediate response was more around the humanitarian piece first. But then what happened was, as we started learning a little bit more from Abel and CARECEN over there, we realized that one of the biggest atrocities was that so many of the children were not accessing their right to due process. And for the most part, it's my understanding that close to almost 50% of these children, if they access their due process right, do qualify for asylum. But because our system is so broken and overwhelmed right now, that's not happening, right? So I think what's happening is that our government, our federal officials, and members of Congress are basically saying, well, let's just make the problem go away by getting rid of these kids, which is a violation of the law. So we've been going at it in different ways, both from a local perspective, a national perspective, and an international perspective. So the international perspective, and this is what's going to be very important for those of you here in Los Angeles and California, or wherever you're from. We've got to all get on the same page and acknowledge that these policies that have contributed to these problems for so many years had to stop. So you have to talk to your elected officials, to your congressional delegation, and tell them, if you're going to put something on the block, on the table in regards to the supplemental budget next week, right, you need to reconsider investing in some of these strategies that have made this problem worse in Latin America. I mean, think about it like this. Look at the whole Prosperity for Growth Initiative in El Salvador right now, right? So the U.S. is basically shaking down the Salvadoran government and saying, look, if you don't accept GMOs in your country, which is going to destroy the agriculture in El Salvador, you're not getting all this money. So, you know, they're cornering the government, right? So, you know, we have to be more educated about these issues, and we have to raise awareness for our elected officials here, especially in Congress, right? On the local front, you know, part of what we're trying to do is push the fact that we want to make sure that these children access their due process rights to go in front of a judge and have legal representation has already been acknowledged, right? At the same time, we're trying to figure out how we can strengthen what has already worked in our communities to address the needs of these children, right? How we can better prepare our school systems to respond to what happens in particular in relation to reunification for those children that are fortunate enough to reconnect with their families. And then on the national front, really building coalitions with you, with all of us. On Wednesday, I was at an all-day roundtable with the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, and one of the things that was touched on is that there was a poll that came out this week that said 58% of the country believes these children should be sent back. And I would venture to say it's not because our country is cold-hearted and because we hate refugees. It's because we are not doing a good job of educating the masses. We're not doing a good job of educating the media about this. We have to do a better job of educating our folks. You know, in particular our young people. I mean, we have young people back there who you know have been in the country no more than 5 or 6 years, and they're kind of like, well, tough, too bad. But again, they kind of lose sight of that. There's that lack of focus on how we educate our communities around this. Because at the end of the day, we all know that if these children get sent back, they're going to come back again. I mean, I already know for a fact there's been reports of children that originally came here with their mothers that have been deported already are now coming back by themselves because now they're so desperate, right? Which is putting these children more at risk than ever before. So it's a multi-pronged strategy, and I'm glad that you guys are doing this. Thank you, CARECEN, and Homies Meals, and the rest of you for doing this, because I think we are all these children have. These are our children, No, I'm not Central American, right? But these are my children. You follow what I'm saying? So it's imperative for us to figure out how we continue to raise awareness like this, but we have to be very action-oriented. And this can't be just one organization doing everything, because this is really complex. We all talked at the beginning of how overwhelming this is. So everyone has to play a role, whether it's supporting the local humanitarian efforts at the border with those people who are doing great work like Catholic Charities and other organizations, or whether it's, you know, supporting our networks and supporting coalitions so that we can educate folks. We're fortunate, you know, you guys are fortunate here in LA as we are in DC, Maryland, and Virginia. But I was just at the hotel today talking to people from Iowa, from other parts of this country who aren't even where we're at right now, and they need help, right? So it's things for all of us to take into consideration. So our hope now is that, lastly, on the local front, that we can put a lot of pressure on our municipal governments. Because one of the good things that happened here, right? So your mayor came out and acknowledged that, you know, they're going to do what they can, right? I believe the mayor of San Francisco did the same thing, right? We had a mayor in Oregon this past week who did the same thing. The governor of my state basically said we should not be sending these children back, right? And here's a man who's running for presidential, has a presidential bid, a presidential interest, who's saying this is not the right thing. So I think we have to also figure out who are those champions. I mean, the last couple of weeks I've been amazed at Congressman Tony Cardenas out of the San Fernando Valley. He's been our advocate in the Congressional Hispanic Caucus on this issue. But we have to be more involved in that civic process and take the time to go and talk to our congressional delegations and tell them, you know, this is not enough, because, you know, again, from what I'm hearing, for every call in support of these children, they're getting 10 calls from people who are not in support of this. So it's on us. It's on us. It's on us to take more action to respond to this need.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you, Luis. That puts a lot on the table in regards to what we can be doing in regards of all these campaigns that the anti-immigrant movement has done, to the rallying in front of the centers where our children are going to. And in one occasion in Murrieta, they stopped the buses from entering the facility, which if we would have done that in regards to stopping the bus from having these people being deported, we would have been arrested, I believe. Who doubts that? You know, we really think that what they've done is it's basically inhumane. The fact that they're screaming at children, it becomes difficult to understand that, right? Is how can somebody hate children? How can they not provide shelter for children? Who can give us a little response to that? Why is this anti-immigrant movement hateful language being used? Thank you.
See if this reaches.
Just put it.
Okay, so I guess a point that you just touched on that I think is very important is education. Education for everyone. Not just education for the people against our cause, not just education for the people for our cause, not just education for the kids, education as a whole. So my story, and I'll give you a 10-second version. I was born in Colombia to a single mother, much the same way that many of these kids' stories begin. And through a twist of fate, thanks to education, my mother's education, she got a job teaching at the American Embassy. And lo and behold, she ended up marrying my stepfather, who was an American diplomat. And because of that, I got to travel the world and spent almost 6 years in El Salvador before, during, and after the Civil War, and got to witness a lot of stuff. And at the end of the day, now that I've ended up as a director of a youth academy for these kids, I see that education is the key, you know, for everyone. Whether it be to make this a new generation of educated immigrant youth that will actually change their circumstance and not just their scenery. And what I mean by that is, when these kids are going from the fields of Guatemala to the fields of Fresno, all we're changing is the scenery. The exploitation remains the same. When we're taking these kids out of San Pedro Sula and they end up, up by 6 in Alvarado, falling victim to the gangs there, we're just changing the scenery. We're not changing the circumstance. And what we look to do at Casa Libre is to change the circumstance, to teach these kids, first and foremost, the value of education, so that then they can, have the blinders removed and start thinking in bigger terms than just what they were told that they were coming here to do, which is work and whatever you can get, and that's it. And so we're trying to, step there in the middle, and educate these kids, so that not only they can get ahead and really create a better life for themselves, but so that they can also change the status quo that's keeping us in this vicious cycle. If these kids start becoming, educated professionals, and on top of that documented if they're eligible for asylum or any other kind of immigration relief, we're going to slowly start changing the problem from our end. Instead, obviously I believe that the government should do their part, but something that we believe very strongly at Casa Libre is we need to do our part. We need to do everything in our power to change the situation. And if we do that, then we can start demanding for other people. But if we're not doing everything in our power, then I think that we need to demand a little bit more from ourselves. And as far as us, I think raising the education, of us by coming to meetings like this and getting informed about the situation is step number one. And then disseminating that accurate information to the rest of the community, which is often misinformed. I think I went completely off point there, Alex, but...
No, but it's important. It's really critical, when it comes to education. That's one of the things that also the lack of education, and there's no opportunities there. Yes. So we have that issue that if we could provide it here, it's critical. But we also find ourselves here in the school system, having to deal with inadequate education systems, that really don't teach our young men and women in our community, how to become a more, or get involved into an educational career where they're going to get a degree and whatnot. Most of them end up dropping out of the classroom, and many of them are immigrant kids that come here that have to deal with the issue of culture clash, right? What's going back to you in regards to that? How are these children that you're dealing with dealing with the trauma that they're bringing with them?
Well,
the trauma of being that they dealt with in their country of origin, but also as immigrant children coming through Mexico and then having to deal at your doorstep.
These kids deal with so many different kinds of trauma that you can't even imagine. And now that you bring up the trauma, I'd like to bring up a very important point, which is child-sensitive interviewing techniques, which is something that we're also seeing a very severe lack of. And what I mean by that is a lot of these kids are, as we know, they're fleeing violence, they're fleeing persecution, they're fleeing terrible situations. But when they're being interviewed, they're not bringing them up out of fear of being associated with a gang, out of fear of repercussion, fear of the system, fear of a lot of things, and they're not saying it. And so then we have, different officials saying, well, they're not saying anything, but that's because you're not interviewing them in the right way. You're not approaching them with child-sensitive interviewing techniques that will allow you to get the full, accurate story out of this kid. So that's the first thing that we really see as a problem now with regards to dealing with their trauma. And once they arrive here, the issue is lack of services. There's not, unless these kids qualify for Medi-Cal, which sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, there's very, very little that can be done in terms of mental health for them as undocumented immigrants. And so we're finding these kids that have this severe trauma just having to hold it inside until they finally explode, and then everyone's like, well, what's wrong with this kid? Well, you didn't give him access to the mental services that he needed in order to deal with this severe trauma that he had. So that's the main thing that we're finding is the lack of child-sensitive interviewing techniques and the lack of mental health services once they arrive here.
Thank you. Following that question, Elizabeth, can you tell us how Casa Cornelia has been dealing with these issues at the border when they're coming in and having to be dealt an interview, to be able to try to figure out if they might qualify for some type of remedy, ¿verdad?
Well, I want to echo the fact that the Border Patrol is the very first law enforcement agency that the children come across. The Border Patrol agents, and I can't paint them all with the same brush. There are some very good, sympathetic Border Patrol agents, but then there's some that are not. I have had experience where children have been interviewed with while being handcuffed as young as 5. So definitely we have to demand the government does implement child-friendly type training. We also need to enforce the fact that when a child is in detention, the child is provided with medical and mental health services. However, as soon as that child is released from detention, everything stops. I want to make sure that for me as an attorney, a child who's well balanced and has a good concept of what they are going through is much more valuable as a witness on his own behalf than a child who's still going through trauma and who doesn't have the support system that they need. So for me, having a child working alongside mental health professionals, it's 100% better than having a child who doesn't have that support. So while the child is in detention, I'm able to work and access and refer that child to psychologists and counselors and clinicians. I would urge the community to insist that those same services follow that child out of detention, because they have already been identified while they are in detention. All they have to do is make sure that identification and the services that the child has required while in detention follows them outside of the detention facility. And I think that also we do have to demand of ourselves that when we see a child who has these issues, we have to demand of our community, our neighbors, our teachers, to identify that child and to bring that child to the people who can help him or her. I have seen many times where the child comes into a sponsor's, that's what we call them, a sponsor's home. As soon as the child starts showing those signs of trauma, that family who took him in will kick him out of the house. That is not acceptable. And as a community, I think that we should all reject that type of behavior by the adults who first and foremost swore to the government that they would take care of this child. They would provide not only housing, education, shelter, food, and whatever that child needed in order to be able to go through the immigration process. These children are being dropped off and in the cold sometimes, so much so that the child, sometimes they are reunified with people in the East Coast. They have called us, urging us to please call them back because they can no longer live with the sponsor because the sponsor is either physically abusing them, denying them food, refusing to take them to school, or refusing to take them to the attorney or immigration hearing. That is a death of a case for us, and we have had occasions where we had to actually refer that child back to the federal enforcement and federal agencies to be able to take that child back. As a community, we have to implore those people who actually say they will take care of those children out of the facility. Let's hold their feet to the fire and say, you said that you were going to take care of this child, you must take care of the child. And if you cannot, you have to be true to yourself and return this child to either CPS or any social service agency that will be able to take care of this child. And we do that in San Diego. We have done that in the past, and I would imagine that it's going to happen a lot more often because now there has been an increase in over 700% of these kids. So I think we have to be, as just members of the community, not only just attorneys or workers within this specific field, as parents, because I am a parent. I do see my children's friends. If you see a child's friend having issues, and you know that the background of this child that just recently came in this crisis, make sure that you tell someone. Tell the teacher, tell the principal. That would be very helpful, and not only for that child, but for your community, because that child will get the services that child deserves.
Really briefly, I'd just like to say that along with holding their feet to the fire, as you just mentioned, I think we also should support them any way we can, because a lot of these sponsors that I've come in contact with that have not taken care of their duties have done so because they have no idea where to seek services. They just don't know what to do, and they have 2 kids of their own, and it's just too difficult a situation. So it's a lot of times it's them not fulfilling their duty, but a lot of times it's just lack of information, lack of services. So I think along with holding their feet to the fire and making them responsible for the kids that they swore that they'd be responsible for, we should also be supportive in sharing information that we get at venues like this with them, so that maybe they get the access that they need, and then that saves a kid from being put on the street.
Thank you. Marta?
I just want to go back to a question that you had in terms of what has been the U.S. response. one of the most alarming things that have happened in the last few weeks is that President Obama asked the Congress to change the 2008 law that protects children from Central America, unlike Mexican children who are deported immediately, to take away those protections to children from non-contiguous borders, such as Central America, to take away those protections and take away the right to due process, and to take away the opportunity to appear in front of an immigration judge. So, and we have heard in the narrative from our elected officials and from both at the local, state, and federal levels that these children should be deported as quickly as possible. These children will be deported as quickly as possible. And we believe that that is tragic, because what will happen is that you're going to be sending children to die. And we have to decide, what country do we want to be? Do we want to be a country where, you know, we uphold our principles, where we can protect children, or do we want to be a country of racism and hatred and intolerance and having no compassion? And so, to us, the most immediate need in terms of our advocacy is to ensure that these protections stay in place. And if you're going to do any changes, that it changes to protect more children, to protect Mexican children, for example, because they're also suffering some of the same violence that we see in Central America. So, you know, we have to, as a community, come together, even if we do it collectively. Collectively is always better, but even if we don't do it, even if there's 3 separate campaigns going on, but to make those calls, to flood those offices, to send those letters, to overwhelm them, to shame them, because now we have both a Republican and a Democratic senator who are pushing legislation already in the Senate, and it's going to be fast-tracked so that we can deport them as soon as possible. Once that we lose that, then it's expedited removal, and we won't be able to save, you know, most of these children. And so that is critical. That is the line of the sand right now. Immediately, we need to come together at the local, at the state level, at the national level to do that work. We have talked with Democratic leaders who are so-called champions. We have talked to as many people who will listen to us in the Congress and in the White House, and their response to us, believe it or not, has been, it's an election year, you know, we will come up publicly, but some people might do otherwise. They might not hold together because they're afraid that they're going to lose their election, and you have to make us do it. They put it, that was literally what one of the leaders of the Hispanic caucus, one of the leaders of the Democratic Party, I won't say that he's the congressman for this district, I won't say that, said to us, you, Marta CARECEN, make me do it. You know, that's, to me, that's ridiculous. But that's something that we need to really, in writing and flooding and doing that, because that is one of the things that, you know, that we have that does protect children.
Gracias, Marta. Following that, you know, Luis, I want you to answer kind of 2 questions at once. One is, what is happening with this other group of immigrants that's coming in? And maybe you could answer as well, Elizabeth, with those children that are fleeing, that are coming to the border, that have tattoos related to gangs, that are fleeing their own gangs, that have been victims of police repression and those policies, right? What is happening with those children is one key question in all of this. And also, is it about that specifically? Is it about this gang violence, or is it more than that? And how can we push that out? Because, and I bring this because we have seen countless and countless of articles and newscasters talking about that gang members are trying to come in, recruit more people into their gangs through this loophole that is the 2008 law. I think that is wrong, it's a tragic, it's a wrong way to look at this issue. But what is happening? Are we having children coming in that are fleeing as well? That are getting involved?
Yeah, yes, Alex. I mean, clearly, there's a significant migration of children throughout Central America that are fleeing the violence. I mean, that's really what this is about. Again, as was said before, it's not necessarily an immigration issue. It's just children who are really trying to flee the violence. Many of the young people that my programs deal with back in Montgomery County, both in the community and in the schools, has demonstrated that day by day. Each and every one of the children that we deal with have shared those stories. You know, my father was a bus driver. Y no pagó la renta, and they killed him. And you know, my mom said she was scared that I would be next, and so you know that's what's been driving it, right? But then the other thing is that the gang piece in this has become like the political pawn. It's been the easy scapegoat in this. I mean, you know, we can't deny that the gangs have played a huge role in you know, public safety in all of Central America. But when you look at across the board, what's really been driving a lot of the violence, it's state sponsored. Hector Silva wrote a book called Crónicas Negras that highlights how the inherent corruption within the PNC in El Salvador has played a major role in drug trafficking and violence. And these are the same people who have the private interests of security. They run private security in the country, and so it's to their benefit for there to be instability in public safety. So I think we have to be careful and understand that this is not just a byproduct of the gangs. While the gangs have played a significant role in the violence in those countries, much more of the violence, even looking at Mexico, it's state-sponsored violence. You know, and there's no doubt about it. But when we look at CNN, when we look at all the mainstream news outlets, you know that there's no forum to talk about that. And when you do see a good article, whether it's in Huffington Post or whether it's in Color Lines, right? How many people are really talking about that? You know, it's oh, interesting. Okay, boom, move on to the next one. Oh, there's gangs coming. You know, and that's what the focus is. Real quickly, I wanted to respond to something that kind of in terms of what my brother Bustamante was talking about, because my experience back on the East Coast is that in light, you know, we deal with those same issues with the parents as well, and part of it is kind of like what I learned when I went to El Salvador. When I'm done working in Guatemala, is that these families, these elders, they have not healed. They have not healed from those wounds that the wars left, from all the genocide that took place back in the 80s. And so when these children come here with that trauma, now it kind of opens old wounds for these adults or these older folks, and so they're unable to deal with it. So one of the things that we've been doing in a lot of our school programs is we've been implementing strategies that focus on transformational healing for the parents, so they can build their skill set to deal with the children, because let's be honest, our foster care system is not equipped to deal with the high volume of these children. So the best situation, as Sister Elizabeth had said, was to figure out ways to strengthen the capacity of the parents. At the same time, we've been doing the same thing with our young men. And one of the things that we learned, in particular with these young men who have recently arrived, we've been very successful in implementing culturally based trauma-informed practices. You know, very similar to some of the Joven Noble work that you do here in the schools. And so it immediately provides these children with coping skills. Same thing with the parents. You know, I'll end on this note, but in one of my parent presentations, I talked about, you know, the violence and the trauma and kind of how parents, because of their inability to deal with their own issues or their inability to heal from their own trauma, kind of repeat the cycles with their children. And so there was a stepfather in the audience, and apparently the next day I get a letter from the teacher, and she said that night the father reflected on the things that I was talking about, and he went and immediately apologized to his two boys. They were his stepsons, you know, and he said, look, clearly I have not made our home welcome to you, you know, but this has been really hard and challenging. And so I think that to some extent, you know, how we can expand and grow those kinds of strategies is going to be important for us locally to build the skill sets of our parents to deal with their children, but to create safe spaces for the children to heal from their trauma.
Thank you.
And I would like to answer the question about the gang and what we see. In our practice, most of the children that do come to us and tell us a story relating to gangs, it is typically the one that has been forcibly picked up and has been forcibly maybe tattooed, including the girls. Because a tattoo is a marker. So they essentially claim the child as theirs, because if one gang doesn't claim that child as theirs, another gang will. So that is what we have seen in our practice. When we do ask the child, do you have any tattoos? Typically it will be a very embarrassed look and say, well, I do have one, but it was forcibly put on me by the gang. So that is the context within we have seen the tattooing and the gang-related stories. On the other note, I'd like to follow up with, yes, our community is not equipped sometimes to deal with the issues that these children are bringing with them. Even if they are parents, because what we have seen in the average, these children have been separated from their parents between 7 and 10 years. So there is a lot of adjustment that needs to happen in that home. Not necessarily only just because you are related by blood will you instantly become a family. You need to have support, you need to have the tools in which to be able to relate. And a lot of these children have been living on their own, especially the ones that are 14 and 16. They're not used to parenting or parents telling them what to do, when to do it, and how to do it. So I think it goes both ways. The parents need to learn and have to be aware. I guess the awareness is very important. They are coming, they're not the 3-year-old that they left behind with grandmother or with the auntie. They are, 15, 16-year-old boys or even men, because of that in those countries, as a 14-year-old, especially Guatemala, has been working for half his life already, has been earning a living. So to come into an environment in which he's treated as a child, or while he feels he's treated as a child, is very difficult. So I would encourage the community service agencies to identify those needs on both ends, on the child as well as the parent.
Thank you. And do we know where these children are being sent? Do they get classified as gang members behind those tattoos?
It depends. It very much depends on the clinician, on the case manager that they get. There are different level facilities that house the children. It's just the foster care system. There's different level categories of security. The low-level security, medium level, and high level. And depending on the case manager who has identified the child, that child will be placed on the need that was assessed by that clinician.
So ultimately they can end up being in juvenile hall then?
No, they cannot be placed in juvenile hall because as of when the Department of Homeland Security was created, the Human Health Services now is the physical custodian of all the children that are placed in custody. And they have shelters specifically dedicated to the unaccompanied child, not in a juvenile facility. They have to be in a shelter specifically created for them, run by the Health and Human Services and the Office of Refugee Resettlement.
Thank you.
Real quick, I just wanted to mention that the Youth Justice Coalition is currently doing a study on just that, on the gang labeling. So if anyone wants to look up the Youth Justice Coalition and see what they're doing on that gang labeling issue, you can go ahead and look them up. They just started, so they're still in the beginning stages, but they're definitely looking into it.
Okay. Thank you. And the Youth Justice Coalition been really actively working in the area around issues of youth, all the way across from criminalized youth to people incarcerated in solitary confinement. going to the what's been the community response, Marta, can you tell us, what's been these organizations or people that have joined in regards to going to these facilities and rallying outside of the federal buildings as we did last week, and what has been the response to those anti-immigrant, also people that are rallying at a local level?
Sure. As you can imagine, it's been kind of crisis mode in the last few weeks, and a lot of our organization have been trying to work mostly in 4 key areas. One is in terms of legal representation for these kids. We have a legal department, we represent some of the kids, but how is it that we can maximize those resources? How is it that we can collaborate with other organizations? And in that effort, we called together a coalition of legal groups, both local and national, that are here in Los Angeles about a month ago. And we brought all of those together, KIND, Esperanza Project, CARECEN, the ACLU, NIL, and the local universities who have legal clinics for their law schools, and other smaller kind of legal providers. And we have formed this coalition. We're doing a press conference on Tuesday here at CARECEN to talk about TVPRA and not doing away with the protections. We're having a community forum to provide information about what should you expect in terms of the legal process, and that is next Saturday, the 26th, at the First Unitarian Church. We're not going to be doing consultations at this event because consultations for these kids are very delicate and require privacy, one-on-one. Each intake could take you an hour, a little bit over an hour, so it's not that environment, but hopefully that we can place as many kids as possible in terms of legal representation. And really kind of advocating to philanthropy and to the federal government to dedicate dollars to organizations that provide that type of service, or others to provide legal representation for these kids, because as Elizabeth was mentioning, once they're released to their families or to the sponsors, then they're on their own. They have to find their own legal representation. The other area is in terms of advocacy, right? How is it that we can really advocate with our elected officials at the local, state, and national level to make sure that we are not giving away, these protections for the $3 billion and negotiating that we are potentially, looking for other solutions like a human rights parole, right? Something that's a temporary permit as kids are waiting for their cases, to further protect them from deportation and going back to a dangerous situation. And other kind of advocacy efforts. And obviously that, it's very political, especially in an election year. The other area is other services, right? Because as the compañeros were mentioning, these kids and these families need a wide range of services, from housing to mental health to a whole bunch of others, transitioning into schools. And so how is it that we can work with partners in those areas to kind of also do this collaboration to enhance and be more effective and efficient in providing those services. CARECEN, for example, we don't provide mental health. However, how is it that we can make our facility available, for example, to an organization like Clínica Romero, who does have resources for undocumented children, so that maybe they can do those type of services at their facilities, but also multiply them by doing them here, helping the kids that we are representing legally, in their legal case. And then the last piece is the media. I think that the narrative has been very much against the kids. They're criminals, they're coming because of a permiso that the coyote promised them. There really is no violence. They're disease-ridden, they have scabies and tuberculosis. I don't even know what scabies is. I had to look it up. and really, how is it that we can, because that's a machine, that's a machine in terms of, very uninformed reporters to the Republican Party and anti-immigrant groups who have all the resources that they need to really kind of do this at all levels, And so how is it that we combat that with limited resources, but how is it that we can multiply those voices? And I think a key thing about changing the narrative is really kind of expanding our coalitions, right? Looking to other groups that potentially we haven't been been working with in the last few years, right? But that we definitely worked with during the sanctuary movement, during the solidarity movement, that is not that different. So how is it that we can expand our networks to work with churches, to work with, people that are child advocates? We haven't worked with child advocates really ever, and we don't normally think of them, but this is definitely a child issue. How is it that we work with, mental health providers to talk about the traumas and really expanding that message? And so we're doing a whole lot of media advocacy. One of the key things that we're working on that hasn't been easy is how is it that we bring a lot of the stories to the forefront, right? Because I really believe that if we can tell those stories, if those kids can tell their story, if those parents can tell the story about how difficult it was to make that decision to bring their children unaccompanied, because it was either that or death, But it hasn't been easy because they're traumatized, because their cases are pending, and because they fear for their lives. And so, for example, for the press conference, we're going to have some children available, but it's going to be only a few one-on-one interviews because they can't do more than 2 at a time, for example, relive those traumas, blur their faces, change their names. It's complicated. But we know that we need to humanize the story. We need to remind people that this is about children. We need to remind people about the atrocities that they're living and the difficult decisions that they're making. So we've been working on those kind of 4 areas, and of course, we work in a number of collaboratives in a number of spaces, and at the local level, at the national level, at the international level. For example, I'm leaving on Sunday to go to El Salvador with a delegation for Ending Long to do advocacy in El Salvador and in Central America to make sure that the Central American governments are also taking responsibility and doing their part, providing resources for these children that are their children. They're our children, they're their children. And they also need to kind of do their job and put up some resources as well to make sure that these kids have the services that they need.
Thank you. And speaking on that, we had the University of Central America in El Salvador, UCA, is putting out a report during that period in regards to a study that a research that they've made and how many children have been deported to El Salvador. So that report is also going to be put out during that time, correct? And then, unfortunately, we couldn't get the webinar going, but we had Elizabeth Kennedy, who's a scholar who also doing his thesis and interviewed over 400 youth who have been deported to El Salvador and did her research. Unfortunately, she's not here, but part of her documents that she's done are on the table for those that want to read more on her report on what she's done. Also, going into those short-term goals that we need to do in regards to what should be those issues that we should focus on immediate, right? We would like to speak on more, as you said. We need to collaborate, we need to target the media, we need to tell our stories, we need to target our local officials. But what else can we do as a short-term and then a long-term goal, right? What are those things that are going to be ongoing? We know that immigration, it's not going to stop. We know that sending more officers and sealing the border is not going to stop this youth coming in, because they're not jumping the fence. They're coming to and turning themselves in because they can't. They're fleeing. They're seeking asylum, right? So what is that long-term goal and the short-term goal in regards of dealing with this issue? Can we start with you, Luis, in regards of this issue, obviously?
Well, I want to echo what Martha said. It was really critical. We had to do a better job of framing it outside of just the Brown paradigm, right? It's really, about getting people like Marian Wright Edelman to do the same advocacy. I mean, she has yet to say anything, right? But we need to get people like Marian Wright Edelman to say something about this. We had to do a better job, again, of educating not just our own community, but other communities about this, right? Because, you got to look at it from the perspective of like what's going on here in this country already, right? Where you have other marginalized communities who are struggling through racism, the school to prison pipeline that affects not just brown kids but African American kids as well. And so we have to figure out how we build those coalitions with those other communities as well. I mean, we can't do it alone. I would venture to say that's one of the things that destroyed the immigration reform movement, is that there wasn't adequate work done to really build coalitions nationally with other communities. So I think that's one of the important things. But then the immediate things that Elizabeth was talking about, making sure that we're doing everything we can to protect it's called the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, and saying by no means should that be amended, changed, or anything. I mean, we all know, everyone in this room knows what's been going on. And so this is the only piece of legislation that's going to protect these children. So we're going to have to fight to make sure that's stayed in there. And then, you know, next week is the budget discussion on the on the supplemental budget. And so again, as was mentioned earlier, we have to make sure that we're letting our members of Congress know that we do not want to support any supplemental thing that's going to send more Border Patrol agents, is going to call for more punitive measures, is going to call for deportations, or for policies that's going to continue to make the problem worse in Central America either. See, we can't lose sight of that. We cannot lose sight